Few American presidents have been as controversial as Andrew Jackson. Jackson's presidency from 1829 to 1837 was a watershed development in American politics, meaning Jackson's presidency brought fundamental change. This PowerPoint presentation will examine those changes that were embodied in the person of Andrew Jackson, as well as in the controversial events of his presidency. To fully appreciate the change that occurred with President Jackson, we must first examine pre-Jackson America. The 18th century political elite of America was comprised of a group of men who saw themselves as a cut above the average person. They held to an ideal of national political life that can be summed up with the word republicanism. The essential aspect of republicanism is that government was best left to what may be called an aristocracy of merit. This is distinguished from an aristocracy of birth, characteristic of European countries at the time. Republicanism rejected the notion that leadership is something a person is born into, like a king or a nobleman of Europe might have been, but something earned by hard work, study, and, of course, strength of character. The qualities necessary to be a leader in the new republic were quite rare, and not something the common man possessed. The ideal Republican leader was not only well educated and intelligent, but also thoroughly disinterested in acquiring power in the first place. George Washington was often held up as a model of this ideal, as, according to legend anyway, he did not really want command or the presidency, but had both kind of forced upon him because his nation needed his services. If Washington actually wanted power, he would have had to seek it in very subtle ways that would not reveal his true ambition, lest his obvious ambition provide proof of his unworthiness for the office he sought. For Republicans, it was considered unseemly to actually campaign for office, and again, proof that you were unworthy of having it. An independent source of wealth was also considered essential for a public office, and that men of wealth would have no reason to be corrupt. Since they already had all the money they needed, they would never be tempted to take bribes for political favors. Republicans believed in holding elections for public office, but typically in these elections, voting rights were restricted to those deemed worthy of having them. Thus, most states in the early American Republic restricted the right to vote to men who held substantial property. In early New England, some states even denied the right to vote to those who were not church members in good standing, as being a non-churchgoer, in view of New England Yankee, the typical New England Yankee, was proof of a lack of character. Women, the poor, blacks, free or slave, and Indians were not considered worthy of the vote either because they were too dependent on others, or because their poverty and inferior social position were proof of insufficient character to qualify as a disinterested Republican voter. Early American Republicans, in short, were elitists. They believed that people had a right to good government, but that was not the same thing as the right to participate in government. 18th century Republicans were likely to be horrified by today's political campaigns and mass democracy with its universal voting rights. They would likely consider politicians like Barack Obama, for example, as totally unworthy of political office, not because Obama is black, by the way, but because he actively sought political office and was openly ambitious and depended entirely on political office for his wealth and stature. Prior to his life in politics, Barack Obama would be a nobody, who had done nothing to distinguish himself as worthy of political office. People like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, on the other hand, were all men of wealth and independent means who had distinguished themselves as successful planters, lawyers, or soldiers, or all three, before assuming political office. This is not to pick on Barack Obama, by the way, because virtually all of today's political leaders in both political parties fit the same mold. Jeffersonian Republicans realized that poor men with political ambitions were very dangerous to liberty. They were tyrants in waiting who would destroy American liberty. Neither life, liberty, nor property could be safe with political power in such hands, according to their view. Democracy, from the point of view of early Republicans, would have to be checked or limited for the sake of liberty. By the 1824 presidential election, the nation had grown tremendously. New states in the West, such as Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and Illinois, had been admitted to the Union, and unlike the earlier established states in the East, these new states were largely populated by poorer settlers who were less inclined to be deferential to an established social or economic elite. They were the first states to adopt universal suffrage, or the right to vote, but these states did not typically allow women, blacks, or Indians to vote. They did allow poor whites to vote, however. Frontier society also produced a new breed of political leader and a new kind of politics. For the Jeffersonian Republicans, politics was a game to be played by the elite behind closed doors. The masses of ordinary people were expected to be deferential and accept the leadership of their betters. Now politics came out into the open. This development was spurred on perhaps by another development known as the Second Great Awakening. Beginning in the early 1820s, religious preachers would hold massive camp meetings that attracted thousands of religious converts. The unsettled nature of frontier life had led people to seek a means of holding communities together, and religion and politics provided the glue. The French observer and historian Alexis de Tocqueville traveled through the young United States during this period, and noted how American frontier life bred a kind of egalitarian communalism. People tended to join groups and seek common purpose, whether it be through their churches or through political organizations, with the two often merging, creating religiously inspired social reform movements, such as abolitionism, a movement committed to ending slavery. On the frontier, politics was no longer the exclusive realm of an economic and social elite, because there really was no economic or social elite. Politics was no longer a spectator sport, but a participation sport, and all were invited to participate. The presidential election of 1828 was a watershed election. Prior to that election, small R Republicans like George Washington despised political parties. Those who framed the Constitution back in 1787 did not mention them in the Constitution, and hoped that the new American nation would not be plagued by them. Republicans saw political parties as corrupt and evil cabals, attracting the worst sort of men, men of ambition, seeking to gain and use political power not for the benefit of the nation, but for their own wealth and power. In his farewell address before leaving office, Washington warned Americans to beware of what he called the baneful influence of party. By 1828, however, political parties were fully formed and indeed had attracted men of ambition. One of these men was Andrew Jackson. Jackson represented a new breed of political leader. He came not from the old Virginia or Massachusetts aristocracy, as earlier presidents had, but from the frontier state of Tennessee. Though he had become personally wealthy, he had not been born into it. His reputation was born of a controversial military career that saw him repeatedly butt heads with his superior officers. But his victories on the battlefield allowed him to overcome occasional charges of insubordination. Jackson rose to the rank of general, and his most notable victory came at the end, actually after the end, of the War of 1812, when the forces he commanded defeated a British raid at the Battle of New Orleans. Neither Jackson nor the British commander had received word that a peace treaty between the United States and Britain had already been signed, and thus the battle was totally unnecessary. Nevertheless, Jackson used his military fame to promote his political ambitions. He first sought the presidency in 1824. Establishment political figures in the East regarded Jackson as unfit for office and even dangerous, but Jackson enjoyed support in the South and the West. Though Jackson had more popular votes than any candidate in the 1824 election, he failed to carry the majority vote in the Electoral College required to be elected president. Under the rules laid down in the Constitution, if no candidate receives a clear majority of electoral votes, which are determined on a state-by-state basis rather than a national basis, the decision as to who becomes the next president falls to the U.S. House of Representatives. Though Jackson received not only the most popular votes and the most, but not majority, of electoral votes, the establishment political leaders in the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams, the son of the former President John Adams, as the next president. Jackson and his supporters were furious. They claimed that a corrupt bargain had been struck between Adams and the congressional leaders to deny Jackson what he felt he had clearly won and deserved. Jackson was not a man to be deterred, however, and he came back and won a decisive victory over Adams in the 1828 election. On March 4, 1829, General Andrew Jackson was sworn in as the 7th President of the United States. Perhaps the inauguration celebration gave a hint as to what was to come. One Washington, D.C. socialite, named Margaret Bayard Smith, described the scene at the White House thusly. Cut glass and china to the amount of several $1,000s had been broken in the struggle to get to the refreshments. Ladies fainted and men were seen with bloody noses, and such a scene of confusion took place as is impossible to describe. But it was the people's day, and the people's president, and the people would rule. Clearly Washington society was not impressed by General Jackson. Jackson, though by this time a man of considerable wealth, with a large plantation in Tennessee, was never accepted by the social elite of Washington society. His wife Rachel was deliberately spurned by the ladies of Washington because she first married Jackson and was not officially divorced from her first husband. Though Rachel's divorce was later finalized and the Jacksons married again to make it official in 1794, the ladies of Washington still thought of the First Lady as a bigamist and unworthy to be part of polite Washington society. Andrew Jackson blamed the ill treatment accorded to his wife by Washington society for her death later that year, and he harbored a burning hatred for what he regarded as Washington's snobs and elitists. As President, Jackson would always portray himself as anti-elite and a president for the common man. He railed against the Eastern establishment, particularly the bankers who controlled the nation's finance. Jackson's presidency was notable for three significant crises or controversies. First, in 1828, prior to Jackson assuming the presidency, Congress passed a tariff or import tax bill that dramatically raised taxes imposed on foreign imports to the United States. Known in the South as the Tariff of Abominations, the tariff primarily protected northern manufacturing businesses from European competition at the expense of southern agricultural interests, which exported most of their product to European markets. The state of South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, who ironically became Jackson's vice president, protested that the U.S. Constitution did not authorize Congress to pass such high protective tariffs. South Carolina argued that the proper remedy for such unconstitutional laws was nullification. Despite Jackson's support for a compromise lower tariff, this was not enough for Calhoun in South Carolina, and the state legislature of South Carolina passed an ordinance forbidding the collection of the protective tariff within its borders. President Jackson claimed that no state could constitutionally nullify legitimate federal law, and he threatened to use military force if necessary to collect the tariff. South Carolina then threatened to secede or leave the Union of States and declare its independence. The cartoon here accuses Jackson of creating the crisis that nearly led to the breakup of the Union. In 1833, Congress passed two bills, both reducing the tariff and authorizing the president to use force should South Carolina still resist the collection of the tax. South Carolina, in response, rescinded its nullification ordinance, and the crisis appeared to be resolved, at least for the moment. In the aftermath of the crisis, President Jackson noted, "The tariff was only a pretext, and disunion and Southern Confederacy the real object. The next pretext will be Negro or the Negro or the slavery question." President Jackson was to prove prescient indeed, as slavery did become the pretext for the next crisis in 1860. This time, South Carolina and 7 other southern states would carry out their threat and leave the Union, triggering the bloodiest war in American history. Jackson, however, would not live to see it. During his long military career, Andrew Jackson spent much of his time fighting Indians. Many historians argue that Jackson hated the Indians and wanted them exterminated. This is a bit harsh and unfair, as Jackson never advocated genocide against the Indians. Jackson did, however, believe that whites and Indians were never likely to be able to live peaceably together in one country. He felt that Indian culture was simply incompatible with and inferior to the white man's civilization, and that the Indians would either have to move and give way to their superiors or else assimilate to white culture. The state of Georgia agreed and ordered the removal from the state of all the Indian tribes living within its borders. The Indians in Georgia resisted by filing suit against the state of Georgia in federal court. In Worcester v. Georgia, the court ruled in the Indians' favor, ruling that Georgia could not simply order the removal of Indians from their ancient tribal lands. Jackson, however, refused to support the court order, and instead pressured Indian leaders to accept their removal. Though some Indian leaders accepted a removal treaty negotiated with Jackson's representative, many others rejected removal and prepared to resist. Eventually, 7,000 federal troops were sent to Georgia to assist with the removal of all the remaining Indians in the state of Georgia to the Oklahoma Territory that was set aside for them. The forced removal of the Cherokee Indians is known as the Trail of Tears because so many Indians died in the long march to Oklahoma. Though the actual removal was carried out during the presidency of Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's name has always been associated with the policy of Indian removal. But perhaps the greatest battle of Andrew Jackson's presidency was his battle against the Second Bank of the United States. The issue of central banking had been a controversial one since the earliest years of the Republic. Money at this time consisted of gold and silver coins. Gold and silver had practical uses as jewelry and other ornamentation, and they had been valued by people for thousands of years because of their beauty and rarity. It was this rarity that made these metals particularly useful as money. People would often use banks to store their money for safekeeping. Back then, you would pay the banker a storage fee for keeping and protecting your money. Banks would then issue notes to the depositor, entitling the depositor to reclaim the money on demand by presenting the note to the banker. People rarely came to get their gold or silver, though. Instead, when they wanted to buy something, they merely traded the note as if it were actual gold or silver. So long as people trusted the banker issuing the note to actually have the gold promised by it, the note effectively functioned as the money. that is, the gold and silver. Bankers eventually figured out that they could get away with issuing new notes without the need to actually have gold or silver promised by the note always on hand. After all, if few people ever actually asked to see the gold and lay hands on it, then why even have it? The practice was called fractional reserve banking. Bankers, in other words, would keep only a fraction of the gold or silver on hand that was promised by the notes that it issued, and it was a great way for bankers to make money out of thin air and profit by lending it out at interest to borrowers. Hard money advocates like Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson argued that this practice of fractional reserve banking was fraudulent and dishonest. It was like stealing because as the bankers artificially inflated the supply of money for their own profit, they diminished the value of all the money that was circulating, robbing savers of actual gold of all their purchasing power. Fortunately, the marketplace had an answer to punish the thieves. Bankers who were discovered to be engaging in excessive fractional reserve banking would suffer devastating runs on their banks. Depositors who got wind of the fact that the gold promised them was not in the bank would literally run to the bank and present their notes for redemption in gold or silver. If the banker was unable to produce the gold he had promised, then he would be financially ruined by lawsuits and criminal fraud charges that would leave the bank bankrupt and perhaps even send the owners to jail. The threat of bank runs by both depositors and by competing banks that might come into possession of another bank's notes was what kept the bankers' avarice in check. Bankers did not like this market vigilance, of course, and they sought favor from government to avoid being held accountable. Governments, whether state governments or federal governments, saw an advantage in allying themselves with bankers, and the bankers saw an advantage to allying themselves with government. In exchange for protective legislation, the bankers would often agree to finance government projects that would otherwise be unaffordable if funded through direct taxation. Taxes, after all, were politically unpopular, and raising taxes was a good way to lose an election. It was, and still is, much easier for governments to simply borrow money. Thus was born the idea of a national or central bank. The national bank, as originally conceived by men like Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton, would be the federal government's banker. The national bank would hold tax deposits in its vaults and issue notes on the good faith and credit of the United States government. These notes would also enjoy the status of legal tender, and that they would be acceptable in payment for taxes and other private debt as if they were gold and silver. In addition to loaning this phony money to the government, the national bank could also issue loans to other banks in the event of a bank run, to prevent the bank from going bankrupt when it ran out of gold or silver, that is, real money. The national bank would thus become the mother bank, protecting its favored children banks from the consequences of their irresponsibility. Jackson saw clearly how this scheme would end up making the Eastern banking elite richer while impoverishing the poorer western and southern regions of the country. The inflationary banks would also, by their activity, trigger devastating economic panics or recessions that would leave many people unemployed and businesses financially ruined. The charter for the first Bank of the United States, set up by Alexander Hamilton during the Washington administration, had expired after 20 years, but Congress then reauthorized a new second national bank to help fund the War of 1812. Jackson was determined to put an end to this bank. The bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, was well aware of the president's hostility towards his bank and set out to destroy Jackson. The battle between the two men was epic, with Biddle pulling financial strings to fund efforts to defeat Jackson in the upcoming 1832 elections, and Jackson doing whatever he could to defeat the bank before it could destroy him. And Jackson won this battle when Biddle attempted to rush an early recharter of the bank through Congress. Biddle's efforts to get the anti-Jackson faction in Congress to authorize recharter was successful, but Jackson vetoed the recharter bill and then ordered all government deposits withdrawn from the bank, causing its collapse. This popular cartoon praising Jackson shows President Jackson bringing down the bank and chasing away the evil bankers, one shown with horns, with his order to withdraw the federal funds. The common man to the right cheers Jackson on. Though state governments would continue to charter banks, the federal government would remain out of the bank chartering business until 1914, when the third national bank, now christened the Federal Reserve System, would begin operations. This new national bank continues to operate today, churning out paper money not redeemable in gold or silver or anything else. To this day, President Andrew Jackson remains controversial. Pro-Jackson historians point to Jackson as the first president for the common man. They argue that the so-called age of Jackson was an era where the common person attained social and political equality, with Jackson as their champion. Overlooking his slaveholding and cruel Indian removal policy, they note that by destroying the Second Bank of the United States, he led the way back to hard money and sound economic growth. On the other hand, Jackson was a rather coarse and hard man, who often would brook no opposition. His political rivals labeled him a tyrant or budding Caesar, who paved the way for the imperial presidency, an office that was supposed to be far less powerful and pretentious than Jackson made it. This popular anti-Jackson cartoon of the time shows King Andrew stomping on the U.S. Constitution. It is left to historians to decide, did Jackson bring democracy or tyranny to America?